36 years ago, Captain Yuri Ivanov led 12 Soviet soldiers into Afghanistan's treacherous Panjshir Valley, never to return home. Their disappearance would become one of the Red Army's most haunting mysteries, plunging families into decades of unanswered questions and a nation into uncomfortable silence about the true cost of war. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. February 14th, 1982, Valentine's Day. While couples across the Soviet Union exchanged flowers and promises, Captain Yuri Ivanov was preparing for what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. The 28-year-old officer from Leningrad had already spent 18 months fighting in this brutal conflict, sending letters home to his pregnant wife Katerina about his dreams of meeting their unborn child. The mission briefing was standard: patrol the eastern ridge of Panjshir Valley, gather intelligence on Mujahideen positions, and return to base within 72 hours. 12 men under Ivanov's command, young conscripts mostly, some barely 19 years old. Private Alexei Volkov had been writing poetry in his journal about the Afghan mountains. Sergeant Boris Petrov carried photographs of his 3 daughters in his breast pocket. Each man had someone waiting at home, counting days until their return. The unit departed Base Charlie at 600 hours on February 15th. Their last confirmed radio contact came at 14:30 hours that same day. Captain Ivanov's voice crackled through the static. "Base, this is Unit 7. Position secured. All quiet. We'll report again at 1800. That transmission would haunt Soviet radio operators for decades to come. 1800 hours arrived in silence. Then 2000 hours. Then midnight. By dawn on February 16th, Unit 7 had simply vanished into the Afghan wilderness. The immediate response was swift but futile. Search helicopters scoured the valley for 3 days, finding only wind and stone. Ground units combed every ridge, every cave, every possible hiding place. On February 19th, a reconnaissance team discovered their abandoned campsite, equipment scattered but undamaged, sleeping bags laid out as if the men had simply evaporated from within them. No signs of struggle, no blood, no bodies. 13 Soviet soldiers had simply ceased to exist. For the families back home, the official explanation was maddeningly vague. Missing in action during combat operations. Katerina Ivanova gave birth to her son Dmitry 3 months later, showing him photographs of a father who had become a ghost. The wives, mothers, and children of Unit 7 were left to construct their own theories from fragments of hope and official silence. Had their men been captured? Were they imprisoned somewhere in the mountains? Were they still alive? The Soviet military machine, built on precision and control, had no answers. Internal reports classified the incident as unexplained casualty event and buried it in restricted files. The war in Afghanistan continued, consuming more young lives, but Unit 7 remained a wound that wouldn't heal. 12 families frozen in time, waiting for men who would never come home. Years passed. The Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, then collapsed entirely in 1991. Still, the families waited. Katerina Ivanova raised Dmitry alone, telling him bedtime stories about his hero father who would return someday. She never remarried, keeping Yuri's chair empty at their kitchen table for 36 years. In the chaos of post-Soviet Russia, military records were scattered, lost, or deliberately destroyed. The story of Unit 7 faded into the vast catalogue of Afghanistan's casualties, just another footnote in a war everyone wanted to forget. But some secrets are too heavy to stay buried forever. The truth was waiting in a locked filing cabinet in Moscow, in documents marked with the highest classification levels, in radio transcripts that would make grown men weep. And in 2018, 36 years after that last radio call, the silence would finally be broken. The knock on Katerina Ivanova's door came at dawn on February 20th, 1982. 2 military officers stood on her threshold, their faces carved from stone, holding the words that would shatter her world into fragments that could never be reassembled. "Mrs. Ivanova, we regret to inform you that your husband, Captain Yuri Ivanov, is missing in action." Missing, not dead. Missing. That single word would become both her anchor and her torment for the next 36 years. Missing meant hope. Missing meant possibility. Missing meant that somewhere in the world Yuri might still be breathing, still thinking of her, still fighting to come home. Across the Soviet Union, 11 other women received identical visits. 11 other lives stopped moving forward, frozen in the terrible space between loss and hope. In Volgograd, Alexei Volkov's mother Marina collapsed on her kitchen floor, clutching the telegram until her knuckles turned white. In Kiev, Boris Petrov's wife Elena stared at the officers in disbelief, her 3 young daughters hiding behind her skirt, sensing disaster but not understanding its shape. The military promised investigations. They promised answers. They promised that everything possible was being done to locate the missing men. These promises evaporated like morning mist, leaving the families alone with their questions and their grief. Official channels led nowhere. Requests for information disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Letters to commanders went unanswered. Marina Volkova began what would become a 36-year ritual. Every morning, she set 2 plates on her kitchen table, one for herself and one for Alexei. She cooked his favorite meals, borscht with sour cream, black bread with honey, and left them cooling while she waited for footsteps that never came. Neighbors whispered that grief had driven her mad, but Marina knew better. Madness would have been a mercy. This was something worse, rational hope in an irrational situation. The women found each other gradually, drawn together by shared pain and official silence. They formed what they privately called the Circle. 12 mothers, wives and sisters who met monthly in Katerina's small apartment in Leningrad. They brought photographs, letters, memories. They shared theories about what might have happened to their men. They wrote collective letters to military officials, to politicians, to anyone who might listen. Years passed. Dmitry Ivanov learned to walk, then talk, then ask questions about the father in the photographs. "When is Papa coming home?" became the question that broke Katerina's heart daily. How do you explain to a child that his father isn't dead but isn't alive either, exists somewhere in the terrible limbo of the missing? The Circle adapted to each new reality. When Glasnost arrived in the late 1980s, they hoped transparency would finally unlock their secrets. When the Berlin Wall fell, they wondered if their men might have been held in some forgotten prison camp. When the Soviet Union itself collapsed, they thought surely now in the chaos of change, someone would tell them the truth. Elena Petrova's daughters grew up, married, had children of their own. They named sons after their missing grandfather Boris, keeping his memory alive in a new generation that had never known him. The middle daughter, Anya, became a journalist, spending her career investigating missing persons cases, searching for other families trapped in the same terrible waiting room where her mother had spent decades. By the 2000s, the Circle had shrunk. Some mothers had died, taking their questions to the grave. Others had moved away or simply couldn't bear the monthly renewal of hope and disappointment, but a core group remained, led by Katerina Ivanova, now in her 70s but still setting that empty place at her table, still telling Dmitry that his father was coming home. The world had moved on. The Soviet Union was history. Afghanistan was yesterday's war. But in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, time stood still. 12 families remained frozen in February 1982, waiting for an answer that seemed as distant as the Afghan mountains, where their men had vanished. They could not have imagined that the truth was waiting in a Moscow archive, in documents so classified that their very existence was a state secret. They could not have known that in 2018, 36 years after that terrible knock on the door, everything would finally make sense, and that the answer would be more devastating than any of them had dared to fear. Deep within the mountains of Panjshir Valley, Ahmad Shah Massoud's Mujahideen fighters had turned warfare into an art form. The man they called the Lion of Panjshir commanded respect from both enemies and allies, his tactical brilliance legendary even among Soviet commanders who faced him in battle. In February 1982, his network of informants stretched across every village, every mountain path, every hidden cave where Soviet forces might seek shelter. Captain Yuri Ivanov's Unit 7 was walking into a valley where secrets moved faster than bullets, where every shepherd might be a spy, where the landscape itself seemed to conspire against foreign invaders. The Soviet military had been fighting in Afghanistan for over 2 years, but they still underestimated the intelligence capabilities of their opponents. What the Red Army Command didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their radio communications had been compromised for months. Pakistani intelligence, working closely with American CIA operatives, had provided the Mujahideen with sophisticated interception equipment. Every Soviet transmission was being monitored, decoded and analyzed by fighters who had learned to think 3 steps ahead of their technologically superior enemies. On February 15, 1982, as Unit 7 established their campsite on the eastern ridge, their position was already known. The poetry that Private Alexei Volkov wrote in his journal that evening, describing the terrible beauty of the Afghan sunset, would be his last. The photographs that Sergeant Boris Petrov arranged by his sleeping bag, images of 3 daughters who would grow up without their father, would be found scattered by mountain winds. The attack, when it came, was swift and overwhelming. Intercepted radio transmissions, declassified decades later, would reveal the brutal efficiency of what happened next. At approximately 0300 hours on February 16th, Unit 7 was surrounded by an estimated 40 Mujahideen fighters. The assault lasted less than 15 minutes. In the darkness, confusion, and terror of sudden ambush, 12 Soviet soldiers fought their final battle. But the real tragedy wasn't the ambush itself. Wars produce ambushes. Soldiers understand the risks they face in hostile territory. The real tragedy was what happened after the shooting stopped, in the decisions made by men in Moscow offices who would never see Afghanistan, never hold a rifle, never face the consequences of their choices. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested in knowing which places and at what moments of day or night these documented reports reach you. The Soviet Union in 1982 was a nation obsessed with projecting strength. Any admission of vulnerability, any acknowledgement of failure, was seen as a threat to state security. When reports of Unit 7's destruction reached Moscow, a decision was made at the highest levels of government. This incident would be classified, buried, forgotten. The families would be told their men were missing in action. No bodies would be recovered because officially there were no bodies to recover. What the families didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that their government already knew the truth. Radio intercepts had captured the final moments of the battle. Intelligence reports detailed the aftermath. But acknowledging this information would have required admitting that Soviet communications were compromised, that Mujahideen intelligence capabilities were far more sophisticated than publicly acknowledged, that the war in Afghanistan was going far worse than the Soviet people had been told. So the men of Unit 7 became ghosts, their deaths transformed into disappearances, their sacrifice buried beneath layers of classification and state secrecy. The very government they had died serving chose to deny them the honor of acknowledged death, condemning their families to decades of false hope and unanswered questions. In the Panjshir Valley, local fighters treated the fallen Soviets according to Islamic tradition, burying them with respect in unmarked graves that would be forgotten as the war moved on to other valleys, other battles, other tragedies. The mountains kept their secret, wind and time erasing the last traces of Unit 7's final campsite. Meanwhile, in Moscow, filing cabinets filled with classified documents that told the complete story, radio transcripts that captured human voices in their final moments, intelligence reports that mapped out exactly what had happened and why, evidence that could have given 12 families closure, peace, the ability to mourn properly and move forward with their lives. Instead, these documents gathered dust in locked vaults, their very existence a state secret, while mothers set empty places at kitchen tables and wives raised children alone, telling them bedtime stories about fathers who would someday return home. The 1980s stretched before the families of Unit 7 like an endless winter. As the Soviet Union slowly began to acknowledge the human cost of the Afghanistan war, official casualty lists grew longer each month, but Unit 7 remained classified as missing, trapped in bureaucratic limbo that felt more cruel than death itself. Katerina Ivanova watched her son Dmitry grow from toddler to schoolboy, his questions about his absent father becoming more sophisticated and harder to answer. "Why doesn't Papa write letters like Uncle Victor?" he asked when he was 7, referring to his cousin who was also serving in Afghanistan but maintained regular contact with his family. How could she explain that his father couldn't write because the government wouldn't admit where he was or what had happened to him? The circle continued their monthly meetings, their apartment gatherings now spanning years rather than months. They had developed their own intelligence network, collecting scraps of information from returning soldiers, from military wives whose husbands had served in the same region, from anyone who might have heard something about Unit 7's fate. These fragments of hope and rumor sustained them through the long silence of official channels, In 1985, Marina Volkova received what she thought might be a breakthrough. A soldier returning from Afghanistan claimed he had met a prisoner in a remote camp who matched her son Alexei's description. The man had mentioned writing poetry, had spoken of a mother in Volgograd who made the best honey cakes in Russia. Marina's heart soared for exactly 1 week, until military investigators informed her that the prisoner in question had been definitively identified as someone else entirely. These false leads became a cruel pattern. Every few months, one of the families would receive a tip, a sighting, a rumor that their loved one had been seen alive somewhere in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Each lead would be investigated with desperate thoroughness, only to dissolve into another disappointment. The families began to understand that hope itself had become a form of torture. Elena Petrova's 3 daughters adapted to their father's absence in different ways. The eldest, Svetlana, refused to speak his name, building walls around the part of her heart that missed him. The youngest, Irina, created elaborate fantasies about his secret missions and heroic adventures. But it was the middle daughter, Anya, who chose to make her father's absence into a mission. She studied journalism, specializing in investigative reporting, determined to find the truth that the government wouldn't provide. By 1987, even glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness, seemed to have limits when it came to Afghanistan. The Soviet media began reporting more honestly about the war's casualties, about the young men coming home wounded or not at all. But Unit 7 remained invisible, their families still receiving the same form letters about ongoing investigations and classified operational details. The withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in 1989 brought no answers, only a new kind of despair. If their men were prisoners, would they now be abandoned entirely? If they were dead, would their bodies ever be recovered? The end of the war somehow made their situation feel more hopeless, not less. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 initially seemed like an opportunity. With the old system crumbling, surely someone would open the classified files, reveal the hidden truths, give the families the closure they had waited nearly a decade to receive. Instead, chaos reigned. Military records were scattered, lost, or deliberately destroyed. The new Russian government had more pressing concerns than solving old mysteries from a war everyone wanted to forget. Through the 1990s, the circle slowly diminished. Some mothers passed away, taking their questions to the grave. Others moved away as families scattered across the former Soviet territories. But Katerina Ivanova remained, now raising a teenage Dmitry who had never known his father, but carried his name and his mother's stubborn refusal to give up hope. By 2000, nearly 2 decades had passed since Unit 7's disappearance. Dmitry Ivanov was now older than his father had been when he vanished in Afghanistan. He had grown up with empty spaces where memories should be. No father to teach him to shave, to give advice about girls, to share the wisdom that passes between generations of men. His childhood had been shaped by absence, by his mother's ritual of setting empty places at their table, by bedtime stories about a hero father who existed more in hope than in memory. The world had moved on. New wars, new tragedies, new missing persons filled the news cycles. But in St. Petersburg, in an apartment where time had stopped in 1982, Katerina Ivanova continued her vigil. Every morning, 2 plates. Every evening, the same prayer. Every year, on February 15th, a pilgrimage to a cemetery where no body was buried, to honor a man whose death couldn't be acknowledged because his government chose silence over truth. The secret was still waiting in Moscow, in classified files that contained radio transcripts of men dying, intelligence reports that detailed exactly what had happened in the Panjshir Valley. But those documents might as well have been on the moon for all the access the families had to them. The truth remained locked away, guarded by bureaucracy and state secrecy, while 12 families aged into their grief, shaped by decades of questions that no one in power seemed willing to answer. By 2010, Dmitry Ivanov was 28 years old, the same age his father had been when Unit 7 disappeared into the Afghan mountains. The irony wasn't lost on him as he stared at the faded photograph on his mother's kitchen table, comparing his own reflection to the young Soviet captain who shared his features but not his fate. Dmitry had grown up in the shadow of absence, shaped by stories of a heroic father who existed more in hope than memory. His childhood friends had fathers to complain about, to rebel against, to eventually forgive and understand. Dmitry had only questions and the weight of his mother's unwavering faith that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. The circle had evolved over the decades. Original members had died or drifted away, but their children had taken their places. Anya Petrova, now a successful investigative journalist, had become the group's unofficial leader. She brought professional skills to their amateur detective work, teaching the others how to navigate government databases, how to file freedom of information requests, how to pressure bureaucrats who preferred to let old cases stay buried. "We're not looking for miracles anymore," Anya told the group during one of their monthly meetings. "We're looking for closure. We deserve to know how they died so we can finally learn how to live." It was a hard truth, but necessary. Nearly 3 decades had passed. Hope for reunion had gradually transformed into a demand for acknowledgement, for the dignity of confirmed loss rather than eternal uncertainty. The digital age had brought new tools to their search. Social media connected them with other families of missing soldiers, with veterans who had served in Afghanistan, with researchers and journalists interested in uncovered Cold War secrets. Dmitry created a website dedicated to Unit 7, posting photographs and service records, hoping someone somewhere might have information. In 2012, they received what seemed like a breakthrough. A former KGB officer, now living in exile, claimed to have knowledge about classified Afghanistan operations. He agreed to meet with Anya in Prague, promising documents that would change everything. The meeting was a disaster. The man was clearly unstable, his classified documents obvious forgeries, but the experience taught them something important. They weren't the only ones still searching for Afghanistan's buried secrets. Elena Petrova had died in 2008, never learning what happened to her husband Boris. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people who had been touched by her story. Neighbors who had watched her wait decades for a man who would never return, journalists who had tried to help solve the mystery, veterans who understood the particular pain of military families left without answers. At the graveside, her 3 daughters made a pact. They would continue the search their mother couldn't complete. Marina Volkova, now in her 80s, remained the most hopeful member of the circle. She still set 2 places at her kitchen table every morning, still cooked Alexei's favorite meals. "He's waiting for me to find him," she would say, when others suggested it might be time to accept the worst. A mother knows. Her faith had become legendary among families of the missing, a testament to love that transcends time and reason. Katerina Ivanova had aged into a different kind of determination. The desperate hope of the early years had been replaced by grim persistence. She no longer expected Yuri to walk through her door, but she refused to let his disappearance be forgotten. Every February 15th, she held a memorial service at a local church, lighting candles for all 12 missing soldiers. The congregation had grown over the years, filled with people who understood that some losses are too profound to bear alone. Technology brought unexpected developments. In 2015, satellite imagery of the Panjshir Valley became available through Google Earth. Dmitry spent hours studying the mountainous terrain where his father had vanished, zooming in on valleys and ridgelines, trying to imagine what those final days might have looked like. It was both fascinating and heartbreaking, the ability to see the landscape of loss, but no closer to understanding what had happened there. The group began reaching out internationally, connecting with Afghan veterans in other countries, with researchers studying the Soviet-Afghan conflict, with anyone who might have access to information their own government had kept classified. They learned that Unit 7 wasn't unique. Many countries had missing soldier cases from that conflict, families still waiting for answers about loved ones who had vanished into Afghanistan's mountains and never returned. By 2017, the Circle had become something between a support group and a research organization. They had files documenting every lead they had followed, every official they had contacted, every theory they had investigated. Their monthly meetings were working sessions, with members assigned specific tasks, monitoring declassification schedules, tracking down former military personnel, maintaining correspondence with veterans organizations. None of them expected that the answer was waiting in a Moscow archive, in documents that had been classified at the highest levels for 36 years. None of them imagined that in 2018, a bureaucratic routine, the declassification of Cold War intelligence files, would finally unlock the secret that had shaped their entire adult lives. The truth was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. March 15th, 2018. In a sterile government building in Moscow, archivist Sergei Volkov routinely processed another batch of documents scheduled for declassification. After 36 years, Cold War intelligence files were being released as part of Russia's historical transparency initiative. Most contained mundane details about troop movements, supply routes, operational procedures, the bureaucratic detritus of a conflict everyone preferred to forget. Document number 4847 appeared unremarkable. Radio intercepts, Panjshir sector, February 1982. Volkov almost processed it without reading. Instead, something made him pause. Perhaps it was professional curiosity, or maybe the precise date that seemed significant. He opened the file and began reading transcripts that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The documents contained complete radio intercepts from Unit 7's final mission, every transmission, decoded and translated. Captain Yuri Ivanov's voice calling for reinforcements that would never arrive. Private Alexei Volkov's panicked reports of enemy positions. Sergeant Boris Petrov's final words to his commander, before the radio went silent forever. 36 years after their deaths, the men of Unit 7 were speaking again. If this case has already gripped you, hit the like button. It helps the story of Unit 7 reach more people. Volkov understood immediately what he had discovered. These weren't just historical documents. They were evidence of a massive cover-up that had destroyed 12 families for over 3 decades. The Soviet government had known exactly what happened to Unit 7 within hours of their deaths, had possessed detailed intelligence about the ambush, had chosen silence over truth to protect state secrets and political reputations. As a career government employee, Volkov knew the safe choice would be to file the documents and forget what he had read. But as a human being, and as someone old enough to remember the Soviet-Afghan War, he understood that these families deserved the truth. He made copies of everything before the files disappeared into the declassification process, knowing this might cost him his career but unable to live with keeping such a devastating secret. Anya Petrova received the call on March 22, 2018. She was working late in her Moscow apartment, editing an article about missing persons cases, when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. The voice was nervous, careful, speaking in the coded language of someone who understood the weight of dangerous information. "I have documents about Unit 7, the caller said simply. "Documents that have been classified since 1982. If you want to know what really happened to your father and his men, meet me tomorrow at Café Pushkin. Come alone." Anya's hands trembled as she wrote down the meeting details. After 36 years of dead ends and false leads, could this really be the breakthrough they had searched for so desperately? She called Dmitry Ivanov and Marina Volkova, but didn't tell them details. Hope had disappointed them too many times before. "I might have something," she said simply. "I'll know more tomorrow." The meeting at Café Pushkin lasted 3 hours. Sergei Volkov spread photocopied documents across their small table, while Anya read transcripts that made her weep. Her father's voice, captured forever in radio static and military jargon. His final transmission, "Tell my girls I love them." Then silence. Then the devastating aftermath. Intelligence reports detailing exactly how all 12 men died, followed by orders from Moscow to classify the entire incident. "They knew," Volkov said quietly as Anya finished reading. "Your government knew what happened to these men within hours. They chose to let your families suffer, rather than admit their intelligence had been compromised. They let you believe in false hope for 36 years. The documents revealed everything. The ambush had been swift and deadly. All 12 members of Unit 7 had died fighting, their bodies buried by local fighters in unmarked graves somewhere in the Panjshir Valley. The Soviet military had radio intercepts of their final battle, intelligence reports from local sources, even approximate locations of their burial sites. But revealing this information would have required admitting that Mujahideen intelligence capabilities were far more sophisticated than publicly acknowledged, that Soviet communications security had been compromised, that the war was going far worse than the Soviet people had been told. So Unit 7 became a state secret. Their deaths were reclassified as disappearances. Their families were condemned to decades of false hope and unanswered questions, not because the truth was unknown, but because the truth was politically inconvenient. Anya sat in that Moscow cafe, reading her father's final words and understanding for the first time, the full scope of how profoundly her government had betrayed them. It wasn't just that soldiers had died in war. Soldiers always die in war. It was that their deaths had been denied, their families' grief weaponized as a tool of state secrecy, their memory erased to protect the reputations of men who had never faced combat themselves. The truth was finally out, but it brought no relief, only a new kind of pain. For 36 years, the families of Unit 7 had waited for their men to come home. Now they knew their men had been home all along, home in the mountains of Afghanistan, buried in graves that would never be found, silenced by their own government's decision to choose politics over truth. April 5th, 2018. Dmitry Ivanov sat in his mother's kitchen, staring at photocopied documents that transformed 36 years of questions into devastating answers. The radio transcripts lay spread across the table, where Katerina had set empty places for so many decades, his father's final words captured forever in military bureaucracy. "Base, this is Captain Ivanov. We are under heavy fire. Request immediate extraction. Tell Katerina I love..." The transmission ended in static. Katerina Ivanova, now 74 years old, read the intelligence reports with steady hands, despite the tears streaming down her face. Every detail of how Unit 7 died was documented with clinical precision: the time of the ambush, the duration of the firefight, the location of their improvised burial. Her husband hadn't been missing for 36 years. He had been dead for 36 years, and her own government had known it all along. "They let me wait," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time in decades. "They let me set his place at the table every morning, knowing he would never come home to fill it." The circle gathered in emergency session that evening. Marina Volkova, now 85 and the last surviving parent of the original families, listened as Anya Petrova read the complete file aloud. When Anya reached the transcript of Alexei's final words, a message for his mother about her honeycakes and how much he missed her cooking, Marina simply nodded. "I knew," she said quietly. "A mother knows when her child stops breathing, no matter how far away he is. I felt him leave in February 1982, but I kept hoping because they told me to keep hoping." The decision to go public wasn't easy. These documents had been leaked by someone risking their career, possibly their freedom. Making them public would expose the source and potentially destroy any chance of finding more information. But keeping the truth secret felt like another betrayal, another generation of silence protecting a government that had already caused too much pain. Anya Petrova published the story on April 15, 2018, 36 years and 2 months after Unit 7's disappearance. Her article, titled "The Ghosts of Panjshir: How the Soviet Union Buried Its Own Soldiers Twice," appeared simultaneously in 3 major Russian newspapers and was picked up internationally within hours. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of messages poured in from families of other missing soldiers, from veterans who had served in Afghanistan, from citizens horrified by the scope of the cover-up. The Russian government's initial response was predictably bureaucratic. Officials claimed they were reviewing the documents and would investigate the circumstances surrounding the case, but the families were done waiting for official investigations. Elena Petrova's 3 daughters organized a memorial service for Unit 7 on May 1, 2018, Workers' Day, a holiday their father had always celebrated. The service was held at a cemetery in St. Petersburg, where no bodies were buried, but where dozens of people gathered to honor men who had been denied recognition for nearly 4 decades. Dmitry Ivanov spoke at the memorial, reading from letters his father had written to his mother during their courtship. "My father died serving his country," he told the assembled crowd. "But his country chose to let him die twice, once in Afghanistan and once again in the lies they told his family." The speech was broadcast on national television, transforming Unit 7 from a classified secret into a symbol of governmental betrayal. International pressure began building. Human rights organizations demanded that Russia declassify all documents related to missing Afghanistan veterans. Other former Soviet republics began reviewing their own classified files, discovering similar cases of families kept in limbo for political reasons. The Unit 7 revelations had opened a door that authorities couldn't close. Marina Volkova died peacefully in her sleep on June 10, 2018, 3 months after learning the truth about her son's fate. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including veterans, government officials, and families of other missing soldiers. At her request, her casket was carried by young soldiers, the same age Alexei had been when he disappeared in Afghanistan. Before her death, she had finally stopped setting 2 places at her kitchen table. The leaked documents led to other discoveries. Military historians began examining previously classified archives, finding evidence of dozens of similar cases where families had been deliberately misled about their loved ones' fates. The Soviet-Afghan War, already recognized as a military disaster, was revealed to have been a humanitarian catastrophe as well, not just for the soldiers who died, but for the families condemned to lifelong uncertainty. By late 2018, the Russian government was forced to acknowledge what the documents had proven. Unit 7 had been killed in action in February 1982. Their deaths had been known immediately to military command, and the decision to classify them as missing had been made to protect state secrets rather than spare family feelings. Katerina Ivanova received an official apology from the Defense Ministry, along with posthumous honors for her husband and compensation for 36 years of deliberate deception. She accepted the ceremony with dignity, but without joy. "They can give me medals and money," she told reporters afterward, "but they can't give me back the decades I spent waiting for a man they knew was already dead." The truth had finally emerged, but it brought no relief, only a different kind of grief. For 36 years, the families of Unit 7 had mourned missing men. Now they could finally mourn dead ones, but the cost of that closure was the devastating knowledge of how profoundly their own government had betrayed them. October 2018. 8 months after the documents surfaced, Dmitry Ivanov stood at the edge of the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan, holding a photograph of his father and staring at mountains that had kept their secrets for 36 years. The journey to this moment had been both a pilgrimage and an investigation, driven by a son's need to walk where his father had walked, to breathe the air his father had breathed, to understand the landscape of loss. Getting to Afghanistan hadn't been easy. The country remained unstable, dangerous for foreign visitors, especially Russians connected to the Soviet occupation. But Dmitry had found allies, Afghan veterans on both sides of the conflict, who understood that grief transcends politics, that some stories need to be completed, regardless of the risks involved. His guide was Ahmad Shah, nephew of the legendary Mujahideen commander who had controlled this valley during the war. At 53, Ahmad Shah had been a teenager when Unit 7 was ambushed, but he remembered his uncle's stories about the Soviet soldiers who had fought and died with honor, even though they were invaders of his homeland. "Your father was a warrior," Ahmad Shah told Dmitry as they hiked through the rocky terrain. "My uncle spoke of the Soviet officers who led from the front, who died protecting their men. There is no shame in such death, only in the lies told afterward." The landscape was both beautiful and terrifying. Towering peaks that could hide entire armies, narrow valleys perfect for ambushes, stone formations that echoed with ghostly sounds when the wind was right. Dmitry tried to imagine his father's final days here, the weight of responsibility for 12 young lives, the growing awareness that they were walking into danger with no hope of escape. They found the approximate location of Unit 7's final campsite on the 3rd day of searching. Time and weather had erased most traces, but Ahmad Shah's knowledge of family stories and local geography led them to a flat area sheltered by rocks where Soviet soldiers might have made their last stand. Dmitry knelt and touched the ground where his father might have died, feeling both closer to him and further away than ever before. Local villagers began approaching as word spread of the Russian visitor seeking his father's grave. Many had been children during the war, but they remembered stories passed down through generations. An elderly man named Hamid claimed his father had helped bury the Soviet soldiers according to Islamic tradition, treating enemy dead with the respect required by their faith. "They were young," Hamid said through Ahmad Shah's translation. "Young men far from home, fighting for things they probably didn't understand. We buried them facing Mecca, as we bury all the dead. It was the right thing to do, but finding the exact burial location proved impossible. 36 years of weather, landslides, and the chaotic aftermath of decades of warfare had altered the landscape beyond recognition. The unmarked graves that might contain Unit 7's remains could be anywhere in a valley filled with the bones of multiple conflicts. Dmitry spent a week in the Panjshir Valley, hiking to different sites, talking to elders who remembered the war, trying to piece together the final chapter of his father's story. He carried with him copies of the radio transcripts, reading his father's final words aloud in places where Captain Yuri Ivanov might have spoken them. It was both healing and heartbreaking, a way of completing conversations that had been interrupted by death and silence. On his final day, Dmitri performed a ceremony that was part memorial service, part funeral, part celebration of a life that had been denied proper recognition for too long. He and Ahmad Shah built a small cairn of stones at the approximate site of Unit 7's final battle, reading the names of all 12 soldiers aloud and leaving behind photographs, letters from family members who couldn't make the journey, and flowers picked from the valley where their men had died. "They are at peace now," Ahmad Shah said as they stood before the improvised memorial. "Their story has been told. Their families know the truth. The lies that imprisoned them have been broken." The journey to Afghanistan had answered some questions while raising others. Dmitri understood now why his father's unit had been ambushed. They had walked into territory completely controlled by enemy forces, their every movement monitored, their position reported as soon as they made camp. But he also understood that they had fought bravely, had died as soldiers should, protecting each other until the end. More importantly, he had met Afghans who remembered the Soviet soldiers not as monsters, but as young men caught in a war they hadn't chosen, who had fought and died with honor even in defeat. The humanity that politics had tried to erase had survived in the memories of people who had every reason to hate the invaders, but chose compassion instead. Returning to Russia, Dmitri brought with him soil from the Panjshir Valley, water from streams his father might have drunk from, stones that had witnessed the final moments of Unit 7. These became relics in a different kind of memorial, not the false hope of empty places at kitchen tables, but the solid reality of grief acknowledged, truth revealed, lies finally put to rest. The search for Unit 7's physical remains would continue, but the search for truth was complete. In the mountains of Afghanistan, 12 Soviet soldiers had died fighting. In the archives of Moscow, their deaths had been transformed into disappearances, and in the hearts of their families, the long wait was finally over. December 2018. Snow fell softly on St. Petersburg as Katerina Ivanova prepared for what would be her last February ritual. For 36 years, she had set 2 plates at her kitchen table every morning, one for herself, one for the husband who would never come home to fill it. Tomorrow, she would set only one. The memorial service for Unit 7 took place exactly 37 years after their deaths, in a ceremony that finally acknowledged what the Soviet government had hidden for nearly 4 decades. The Russian Orthodox Church had agreed to perform funeral rites for soldiers whose bodies would never be recovered, whose graves lay unmarked in Afghan soil, whose families had been denied the dignity of proper mourning for an entire generation. Dmitri Ivanov stood before the assembled crowd reading from his father's final radio transmission. "Base, this is Captain Ivanov. We are under heavy fire. Request immediate extraction. Tell Katerina I love..." The words that had been buried in classified files for 36 years were finally spoken aloud, in a church, before witnesses, with the reverence they deserved. The congregation included the surviving family members of all 12 soldiers, veterans who had served in Afghanistan, government officials who had come to offer belated apologies, and hundreds of ordinary citizens who understood that Unit 7's story was bigger than just one military unit. It was a story about the price of secrecy, the cost of political lies, the way governments can wound their own people as deeply as any enemy. Marina Volkova's daughter placed her mother's photograph beside the memorial display, next to images of all the parents who had died without learning their children's fate. These mothers and fathers had been casualties of the cover-up, as surely as if they had been shot on the battlefield, their lives consumed by false hope, their grief weaponized to protect state secrets. Anya Petrova read from her investigative report, now expanded into a book that had become required reading in Russian schools. The story of Unit 7 was being taught to a new generation as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unaccountable government, about the importance of truth-telling, about the human cost of political convenience. They were 20 years old, 19, 23, she told the congregation. They had girlfriends, dreams, plans for after the war. They wrote poetry, carried photographs of their families, worried about their mothers. They were not statistics in a military report. They were not political pawns in a Cold War game. They were human beings who deserved better from the country they served. The ceremony concluded with the reading of all 12 names, each followed by the orthodox response: Memory eternal. Captain Yuri Ivanov, Private Alexei Volkov, Sergeant Boris Petrov, 9 others whose names had been classified secrets, whose deaths had been denied, whose families had been condemned to decades of uncertainty and false hope. After the service, Katerina Ivanova walked slowly home through the snowy streets of St. Petersburg. At 75, she moved with the careful dignity of someone who had carried impossible burdens for too long and was finally ready to set them down. In her purse, she carried the last letter Yuri had written to her from Afghanistan, discovered in military files that had been declassified, along with the Unit 7 documents. My beloved Katerina, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I won't be coming home to hold our child, to grow old beside you, to keep the promises I made on our wedding day. But I want you to know that every moment we had together was worth dying for. Raise our son to be proud of his father, but don't let my absence define his life. Live, my darling, live for both of us. That evening, Katerina set only one place at her kitchen table for the first time in 37 years. She cooked her own dinner, ate alone, and felt something she hadn't experienced since February 1982. Peace. Not happiness. The grief would never completely fade, but the deep peace that comes from finally knowing the truth. Dmitry had framed the soil he brought back from Afghanistan, along with his father's final radio transmission and the last letter he had written home. These artifacts of love and loss sat on his mantelpiece as reminders that some stories take decades to complete, that truth is worth waiting for, that the dead are not truly gone as long as their stories are remembered and told. The declassification of the Unit 7 documents had opened floodgates. Dozens of other similar cases were being investigated, other families learning the truth about loved ones whose deaths had been concealed for political reasons. The Soviet-Afghan War was being rewritten from a story of military failure to a story of institutional betrayal, where the cover-ups had sometimes caused more suffering than the original tragedies. On February 15, 2019, 37 years exactly after Unit 7's last radio call, the Russian government announced the creation of a memorial wall listing all soldiers who had been classified as missing in action when their deaths were actually known to military command. Unit 7 would be the first names inscribed, but they would not be the last. The inscription read simply, "To those who died serving their country, and to the families who were denied the truth of their sacrifice. May their memory be eternal, and may such deception never occur again." Katerina Ivanova attended the dedication ceremony, placing flowers beneath her husband's name carved in black granite. She stood for a long moment reading the inscription, thinking about the young captain who had kissed her goodbye in 1981 and never returned, about the son who had grown up without a father, about the 37 years of questions that had finally found their answers. "Now you can rest," she whispered to the engraved name. "Now we all can rest." The story of Unit 7 was complete. 12 young soldiers had died fighting in Afghanistan in 1982. Their government had chosen lies over truth, secrecy over compassion, political convenience over human decency. But in the end, love had proven stronger than lies, persistence more powerful than bureaucracy, and truth more enduring than the systems built to conceal it. In the mountains of Afghanistan, 12 unmarked graves hold the remains of Soviet soldiers who died far from home. In the archives of Moscow, declassified documents preserve their final words forever. And in the hearts of the families who never stopped searching, the long wait is finally over. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Unit 7. See you in the next video. In a world where governments still conceal truth from families, where political interests overshadow human suffering, the story of Unit 7 reminds us that some silences are too heavy to bear, and some secrets too costly to keep.